welcome to our 8th annual Heritage Festival. Our theme this year is Exploring Tampa's Cultural History. This is the second of 4 programs, so stay tuned for more after this. I am a librarian downtown at the Florida History and Genealogy Library, which is at the John F. Germany Public Library. If you haven't ever visited us, please come down. Current displays will support today's programs, and I think we even have a craft bag we'll give out for the next week that supports today's festival. Remember that you can ask questions after Paul has finished speaking, and I do want to introduce our speaker. His topic, the dark side of Ybor, and his name is Paul Guzzo. Paul is the cultural reporter for the Tampa Bay Times. He is the reporter who found the lost segregation era all-black Zion Cemetery. He covers local culture, the local film industry, odds and ends of Tampa history, and a column I always look forward to in the newspaper. Paul has been a journalist in Tampa since 1999, also was an independent filmmaker and known for his award-winning documentary on Charlie Wall, Tampa's first crime lord. Paul also in the past was head writer at, like I said, a newspaper for 10 years, a newspaper that we have on microfilm at the Florida History and Genealogy Library, and wrote a weekly profile on Tampa's prolific personalities. And then he was senior writer at Cigar City Magazine, a Tampa history magazine. And Paul, welcome today. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Oh, just ready to go? Okay. Let me apologize for the blurriness. My kid scratched my webcam, but it's, as I keep joking, it's kind of fitting, I guess, when I'm talking about organized crime, hide my identity. And I'll just get this out of the way. I've been doing these public speaking engagements for 25 years. I'm still not very good at it. So if I hem and haw, looking like I'm searching for words, it's because I am. If it sounds like I'm just reading something, it's because sometimes I am. And I say that because there's nothing more awkward than when you're listening or watching somebody who's a bad public speaker and he starts to like lose track. Don't feel bad for me. It happens to me all the time. I'll make it through this, I promise. So I'm here to talk about Charlie Wall. I'm gonna guess if you're watching this, you've heard of Charlie Wall, but just in case there's not, Charlie Wall, people in his day in the early 1900s knew him as the White Shadow. And that was a nickname to mean he was the protector. They considered him to be the protector of the Latin immigrants in Ybor, even though he was not Latin in any way. But historians really now more so call him the dean of the Tampa underworld. And it's because while he did not bring crime to Tampa, he's really the first person who organized crime. Before him, it was loose syndicates, a group here, a group there. He was really the first one to create this large umbrella organization that not only controlled most of the rackets, but in a way controlled the city. The best way to put him is Charlie Wall is Tampa's version of Al Capone, John Gotti, Lex Luciano. People like to say Santo Trafficante was our first godfather, but no, it was Charlie Wall. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about Charlie Wall, and if I get time, there's some other topics I'd like to talk about, but we'll stick to Charlie Wall. So how did I get interested in Charlie Wall is, like Pam said, I used to write for, like I said, a newspaper, and one of my jobs was that weekly profile, and it had to be, oh boy, probably 20, 21, 22 years ago, I did a profile on Ace Atkins. Ace Atkins was, he's now a best-selling author, but he really made his name. He was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize with the Tampa Tribune for writing a weekly series that probably ran about a month and a half on the murder of Charlie Wall. He wrote it, in the 90s, over 40 years after Charlie Wall was dead, but his weekly stories really resonated because he was going to the sources. He was the first person to really interview all the people who investigated it and covered it and get their stories years later in hindsight. He gets nominated for a Pulitzer. He doesn't win, but just getting nominated is huge. He then writes a book. Like I said, he's now a best-selling author, one of the biggest in the world. But his first book was called The White Shadow. The White Shadow was a fictionalized account of Charlie Wall's murder. So it was based on true story. He just fictionalized it a little bit. After the book came out and that became a bestseller, Lagasetta's, they asked me to go write a profile on him. So I write a profile on Ace. When it's done, we're sitting around talking. He's asking about myself and my family. And I mentioned in passing that my brother is a filmmaker. And he said, well, that's great. I have a favor. And he asked if we could please video some of the sources for his book. And he says, they're getting older. They have these great stories that I have on audio. He's like, but I really think these people need to be filmed on video telling these stories. So of course we're going to do it. So we went out and we filmed Ellis Clifton, who was the head of the Vice Squad, which was the Hillsborough County wing of the sheriff's office that was charged with bringing down organized crime. He investigated the murder of Charlie Wall. We interviewed Bob Turner, who was the Tampa Tribune journalist who covered it. Those were the two people we asked us to interview. We got done and we said, boy, you know, these guys are pretty compelling. This is probably make a great documentary. So that's really how our documentary got started. From there, we interviewed, we interviewed Ellis again, even more thoroughly. We interviewed Ferdy Pacheco, who, if you're a Tampa person, you must know Ferdy, my mentor and probably the Tampa's greatest storyteller ever, and a bunch of other people. But really, more importantly than interviewing him is, I think, the side research we did. We pulled every newspaper article ever written on Charlie Wall. And back then, it wasn't as easy as now. We didn't have newspapers.com where you could just type in Charlie Wall and everything would pop up. We had to go actually day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year of every edition of the newspapers looking for articles. And then that led us to start asking for federal archives, FBI reports. I actually got his boarding school records and so on. And so while I may not be able to tell you everything today, because I may forget some things, I'm pretty confident that my brother and I really had the most intricate research of Charlie Wall outside of the people who grew up with him. So to start from the beginning, Charlie Wall, his roots can be traced back all the way to like the mid 1840s. That's when his grandfather, Perry Wall, migrated south to the during the Second Seminole War. Perry Wall settled in Hernando County, just north of Brooksville, and he went on to become a probate judge and a postmaster. I can't remember how many children he had, I apologize, but really his most successful child was John P. Wall. John P. Wall was pretty much best known, or maybe I don't know if I say best known, but his most important accomplishment was he was the doctor who discovered that yellow fever was being carried by mosquitoes. He later served as the mayor of Tampa. He helped found the Tampa Tribune. He helped Vicente Martinez Ybor found Ybor. He was one of the people who was consulting him on what to do, laying out the streets and helping to recruit businesses. John Wall would marry Matilda McKay. If you're from Tampa, you know the McKay name. They had a mayor in their family, pioneers here, shipping industry. So now the Walls and the McKays were joined by marriage. And then I think Matilda's sister then married into the Likes family. The Likes family, once again, another pioneering family of Tampa, like ships. It's, you know, they still, the Likes building. So now you have the Walls, the McKays, and the Likes families joined together as pretty much one. And so when Charlie Wall was born in March 1880, if you can't say he was born into the most powerful family in the state of Florida, you have to say it was at least one of the most powerful. But I would feel safe saying with those three families joined, they were the most powerful family trio. And Charlie was born into them, which means obviously with what he did in crime, the man was smart. He probably could have done anything he wanted in life. He probably would have been mayor one day, but he went another route. And, you know, I think in the past, people were always looking for some great cinematic plot for why he went and decided to wear a black hat instead of a white one. But the truth is, he was really just a wayward child. There's really no other way to put it. His mother passed away in 1893, and just 6 months later, his father married their housekeeper, Louise Williams. And from Charlie Wall's niece and nephew, who have since passed on, but who I've spoken to, they just put it very simply. Charlie hated her. He thought she was a gold digger. She would go out and buy expensive furs and jewelry with the family money. And Charlie thought, what are you doing? You're not my mother. You're just spending my family's money. And he hated her to the point that, as the story goes, I've never been able to prove this or find backup of it. But as the story goes, he fired a .22 at her and tried to shoot her. He missed. But that's about as contentious as that family relationship was. And then 2 years after his mother died, his father died. So now Charlie is being raised by his former housekeeper stepmother, who he hates. So he did basically whatever he wanted to do. She didn't seem to care. She didn't seem to have any desire to raise him. And so he was doing anything he could to stay out of the house. So what he did was he ended up hanging out in casinos, brothels, bars. He was a regular over at the casinos, the illegal casinos that were operating in what by then would have been the decommissioned Fort Brooke. It got to the point the rest of his family heard what was going on, and they stepped in and they sent him to a boarding school. Oh, I believe in North Carolina. If I'm wrong and you read something I wrote and I say a different state, I apologize. I should have had that written down. So they sent him to boarding school. He didn't last long. Now, the story is, the lore is that Charlie Wall, he was expelled for running illegal gambling at the school, and he got caught visiting brothels. And you can find a lot of those references online. You can even, that's on his Wikipedia page. But like I said before, we actually went out and found his school records. And the truth is he was expelled for a very unsexy reason. He cheated on a test. He cheated on one test, and the school just had a one-strike policy, and he was sent home. So I'm sorry if I burst anybody's bubble, but he was not running illegal gambling in a dorm room at a boarding school. But he was sent back home, and he came back home, and it's still, his family, I guess, kind of gave up on him. Like, all right, we tried our best, and he went back to live with the stepmother he hated, and he went back to doing what he was doing before he went to boarding school. By the time he was 14 or 15, he was no longer just hanging out in these casinos. He was a dealer. He was a craps dealer hanging out in the casinos and you know, running other sorts of games. And one of the great stories I've heard about those casinos back then, and this was from, again, his family, who said that Charlie Wall passed his story on to them, was they had what they called this wasn't Charlie's job, but somebody else's job, was called a keyhole man. And they would sit outside the door of the building where the casino was, or whatever illegal was going on there. And if the police would come by, they would drop a matchstick through the keyhole, and there was somebody on the other side of the door looking to see if a matchstick dropped through. And if it dropped through, that was their cue to hide anything that could have been tied to illegal gambling. And you have to remember, this wasn't like a Las Vegas or Atlantic City casino. These were card games, dice games, and you know, they would make roulette wheels out of whatever they could. I think there's one over at USF Special Collections that somebody actually fastened a little roulette wheel onto a lamp, so you could like carry it around the room like this. So they were able to clear the things out pretty quickly. Charlie, from what I've been told, quickly though, the people who ran these casinos realized he had more value than running games there. These people couldn't, there were certain areas of town the people who ran these casinos could not get into. They couldn't get into country clubs. They couldn't get into the fine dining establishments. Charlie Wall, because of his background, because of his name Wall, because he was related to the McKays and the likes, even though he was a black sheep in the family, he was still accepted. And they saw Charlie Wall as their key to expanding their gambling into the more upper class, because they wanted to gamble too. They just weren't willing to accept some of these dregs who were running these games into, you know, into their establishment. They welcomed Charlie. In fact, this not only helped spread the games into, like I said, some upstanding establishments, gambling was able to spread into City Hall, the police department, because Charlie was able to do those things. And it didn't take long for Charlie Wall to realize, wait, they need me. I don't need them. Why am I working for them? And so as young as in his early 20s, Charlie Wall set off on his own and began establishing his crime syndicate. And he was able to do it, A, because of his connections, but he also had money. He had inheritance. So, I mean, if there's one thing that movies always have right, the bad guys will go work for whoever has the most money, whoever can pay. And so suddenly he's using this upper class background to become the dean of Tampa's underworld. So the main game that Charlie Wall ran, and again, if you're listening to this, you probably know about this, but I'm going to go over it anyway, is bolita. Bolita is, I guess, what you could say, the prelude to the modern lottery. Bolita means it's Spanish for little ball. The game, even though widely became known as a Latin game, it actually originated in France just a few years after the French Revolution. And in the game, what they would do, they would take balls 1 through 100, and people would bet on what one number would be pulled off originally. And it would pay, I believe in Tampa, up to 85 to 1. So in order for the game to get to Tampa, first from France it spread to Spain, from Spain it spread to Cuba, from Cuba because of the cigar industry it spread to Key West, and then when the cigar industry moved from Key West to Tampa because they were going on strike in Key West, Martinez Ybor got fed up with it and decided to come to Tampa and establish a cigar industry here. Besides bringing cigars, they brought bolita. Now originally, bolita was almost like bingo. Like you can find old news archives where bar owners and cafe owners are advertising in the newspaper. We are going to have bolita this Friday night. You know, people were playing for pennies. You know, maybe a nickel and a dime at most. So again, the police didn't really care. It wasn't a big deal yet. It wasn't until players started betting larger amounts of money that the police really decided to crack down on it. The way they played in Tampa is they would put the 100 balls in a sack and they would throw it across the room. There were other ways they would play, but this was the main one. And they would throw the sack across the room, and one guy would catch the sack, and he'd try to grab it by one ball, and he would hold it by one ball. And then someone would come over with scissors and they'd snip the rest of the balls. And 99 balls would fall to the ground, and inside the piece of the sack in his hand would be the one remaining ball. The dreams, people would mainly make bets because of dreams. They would associate different dreams with different numbers. I don't know if it was uniform, everybody had the same one, but when I was with La Gaceta, Willie Garcia, who was just a brilliant historian, once shared with us a list of the numbers that his family would keep. You know, you wagered if you had a dream, you know, again, they would base it on dreams. If you had a dream about a full moon, according to Willie, they were told to bet 80. A fire was number 100. Elephants was 9. If you dreamt about a hog, it would be 33. There was certainly cheating. It was gambling. There were a few ways they would cheat. One way I read about was they would freeze one bolita ball, and they would put it in the freezer so it was ice cold. So if the guy catching the sack grabbed like maybe 2 or 3 balls and he had to choose one, he would know, don't choose the cold one. Because what they would do is if they knew 60 people bet on number 10, obviously they don't want number 10 to win because the house is going to lose money. So if they would freeze the number 10, and if he grabbed it and it was cold, he knew to shift over a little bit and grab the next one over. Another one I heard is they would fill another ball with lead. And when they would do that, they, instead of grabbing the sack, they would just reach in. It would be the game. They would reach in and grab a ball. And if they had a known number that they didn't want to pick filled with lead, that one would sink to the bottom and would never be at the top. The game of bolita eventually did morph. Rather than choosing one number, they began choosing 3 numbers, and gamblers began betting on maybe more than one number or combinations like you would at the horse track. And they also began doing more than just betting on a ball that would be picked out of a sack. They would bet based on whatever the Cuban lottery was. You know, I'm sure some of you have heard these stories, or maybe your parents even did, or grandparents. They would sit on their back porch, and if you sat on your back porch, especially, you know, in Ybor, and they would have the radios to the Cuban stations because they could still get the Cuban radio stations here, and they would listen to the Cuban lottery, and those numbers would be the bolita numbers. Another way they would use horse and dog tracks to determine the winning numbers. So in one such system, the number of the dogs that won, placed, and showed in a specific race were then added together. The tally's left 2 digits were one bolita number, the right 2 digits were another, and those 2 numbers were then added together to determine the third number. And if the third number exceeded 100, the digit to the far left was cut off to make it a 2-digit number. And everybody in town would know well, not everybody in town who was betting would know which race would be, you know, would be the one with the bolita numbers. A lesser known game that was also very popular that Charlie Wall ran was called Bond. And it was another legal lottery, but that one was based on the stock market and the New York Stock Exchange and their bond list. And those numbers would be chosen by taking the 5th digit from the right of each of the 3 closing sales figures. I don't hear much about Bond. I've seen a lot of police reports of people getting arrested playing Bond. You hear more about bolita. I'm just guessing bolita because maybe a little simpler to play. But it got to the point, and again, this is because of Charlie Wall, where you can't say everybody was playing bolita, but it sure as heck seemed like it. I mean, I'd say the safest thing to say, it did not have a demographic. Rich and poor played, Black, white, and Latin, men and women. In 1927, according to news archives, over 300 bolita parlors were located in Tampa, and there were an estimated 1,200 bolita parlors in 1927, and over $20 million a year was getting played. I wish I'd done the math to figure out what that is for inflation. To give you an idea of how widespread this was, again, and this was when Charlie Wall was running things, we had a number of people working for him. One of my favorite stories is, I call her the bolita groceress. She ran a grocery store in Ybor City, and she sold bolita. And when the police busted her, they found her bolita tickets inside her Bible. Charlie Wall did not discriminate. He had women work for him also. The widow of his former bodyguard, Johnny Scarface Rivera, once told me a story about a woman who worked for Charlie Wall named Jitterbug. That's the only thing she would tell me. That was her nickname. Wouldn't give me a real name. And she sold bolita from a grocery store. And she would pick up, and she would also pick up bets from other businesses who sold to deliver them to either Charlie Wall or somebody under him. And the way she would do it is she would pack her car with children, her kids and neighborhood children, so it always seemed like she was just some neighborhood mom shuttling kids around Tampa, and then she'd keep all the bolita tickets in her bra, so if a cop did pull her over, they wouldn't want to search. So again, why was bolita able to flourish under Charlie Wall? It's basically because he controlled the police. He controlled City Hall, and he did that primarily because in 1910 was his big power play. The cigar workers went on strike. They wanted better working conditions, and the factory workers were not going to cave. It's unknown if Charlie Wall supported their cause or this was a power play, but he financially backed many of the cigar workers. He would buy them food, pay for medical bills, and tell them, I'll do that for as long as I can. They ended up losing the strike anyway. They went back to work. They did not get what they want, but they never forgot that. And that's really when he earned the nickname the White Shadow, as their protector. Everybody trusted Charlie Wall has our back, and if we support Charlie, he will support us. And that support, he quickly realized, could equal votes. He was a criminal, and he didn't hide it, but his political endorsement meant something. All of these cigar workers, all these people in Ybor City who knew he would help them even after that cigar strike, if he said, I need you to vote for this guy, they would vote for him because they knew Charlie had their back. And when politicians realized Charlie Wall's endorsement is huge in the Latin communities of Ybor City and West Tampa, they then went after it. And what would Charlie Wall ask for in return? Leave him alone. And also go after his competitors. If somebody, so he would say, one of his largest illegal operations was El Dorado in Ybor. And he would say, leave El Dorado alone. But hey, so-and-so is trying to compete with me, and he's got an illegal casino operating on the corner 2 blocks away. Why don't you bust up his casino? And they were doing that. He went beyond just endorsements. The poll workers would let him do what he wanted. He would stuff ballot boxes. He would pay people to vote more than once, and they would let them. He would pull votes from the ballot boxes. One of the most famous stories came from about this topic, came from Charlie Wall's attorney, and it's on, I wish I could remember his name, but it's on file with USF Special Collections. Gary Marmino interviewed Charlie Wall's attorney, and he tells the story of, and I'm gonna have to read this one. It was the Senate election. Cloud Pepper and Park Trammell were competing in an election for state Senate, and Wall was backing Trammell. It's unknown if Trammell asked Charlie Wall for his support, but they all knew that Wall's support pretty much guaranteed that Trammell would win Ybor City and West Tampa. The only question was, how many votes would Wall allow Pepper to receive? And in one particular district, as the story goes, Charlie Wall said, Pepper's only going to receive 2 votes in this district. And when someone asked why 2, and he says, because his campaign manager and wife live here, and they're the only people who are going to vote for him. And I don't know if that's where the campaign manager lived, but I pulled up the records of the supervisor elections, and in precinct 34 in West Tampa, Trammell won 341 votes to 2. Now, could it be a coincidence? Maybe that story's not true, but I think, chances are that story is true. The numbers show it. And when all the votes were tallied, Pepper lost the election by 3,000 votes. And in Ybor City in West Tampa, where Charlie Wall controlled the votes, Pepper lost by 6,000. So he lost by 6,000 in 2 districts, and that pretty much meant he lost by 3,000 statewide. It was certainly Charlie Wall's high watermark. The state, though, and the city were embarrassed. It wasn't hard to figure out what happened. So the following year, 1935, D.B. McKay, who, yes, related to Charlie Wall, and Robert Chauncey were in a heated election for the mayor. And in order to make sure there's no corruption, let's be clear, this is not me saying McKay was asking for anything corrupt to happen. I'm just saying this, the city and the state said, we need to make sure that this is on the up and up. So the state sent in the National Guard to guard the ballot boxes. At the same time, though, as this election is taking place, a hurricane starts blowing through Tampa. And the National Guard did not stop Charlie Wall's supporters. They were still trying to stuff ballot boxes, trying to steal ballot boxes. A riot erupted throughout the city. And in City Hall today, there's actually a Ferdy Pacheco painting, I believe it's right outside City Hall chambers, depicting the scene of the riot as it happened. And it's really one of Charlie Wall's, Ferdy's more popular paintings. But not everybody liked Charlie Wall. Power equaled danger. People wanted him dead. So much people, he would shoot at him so often that he actually built a steel tunnel. He had a house right in Ybor. Be clear, he did not hide. He had a house right in Ybor City. He had a garage that was separate from the house. So he built a steel tunnel leading from his garage to his house. So if people were shooting at him, he could quickly get into the garage and then use the tunnel to get into the house. He had pillars outside his house, and the house is still there. I wish I could remember the address. I think it's on 17th Avenue. And another one of Ferdy's paintings that he did based on the story is Charlie Wall made sure that those pillars were wide enough. So if he was on his front porch and he saw a car drive up that he didn't recognize slowing down, he could duck behind the pillars to protect himself from bullets, which, supposedly he did. The most famous Charlie Wall assassination attempt story, though, was his driver was named Baby Joe Diaz, known as perhaps one of the great getaway drivers of all time. And he's driving Charlie Wall south on Nebraska Ave when a black sedan with 4 men pulled up beside them. And they pulled guns and they start shooting. And in order to get away, Baby Joe throws the car in reverse to escape. And he does it. He starts weaving through traffic, driving in reverse. Ferdy, again, I'll talk about him a lot. He's one of my best sources on this. He has a more colorful version of the story that news archives don't back, and his was that Baby Joe actually stood on the running board and fired back while with one hand driving backwards. There's no truth of it, but I say we keep spreading that story because it's so great to believe, so let's just pretend it's real. But to really give you the best idea for who Charlie Wall was, following that incident, he held a press conference outside his house wearing his pajamas and his long robe. And he's showing where the bullets are, where they got him. And he's talking about how he got away and how Baby Joe got away. And people always want him dead, but they can't seem to get him. And he's just like bragging at this press conference. And that's another thing. If you go to news archives, you can find the details of this. And it's always fascinating to read. Unfortunately, in 1938, Charlie Wall's business partner, Tito Rubio, was gunned down as one of the 24 murders in the early 1900s, called the Era of Blood because of all the gangland assassinations. They shot him, I believe, outside of the El Dorado Cafe, which was doubled as a casino. Tito was Charlie Wall's partner in that. And Charlie Wall was so angry that this happened that he testified to a grand jury. I still want to get my hands on that grand jury report. I still won't unseal it, but it's unknown what Charlie Wall said because it's never been unsealed, but it hurt his reputation when you talk to some of the old timers who are around. They've since passed on, but they told me that it really sullied Charlie Wall's reputation. People started looking at him as a rat, and he was really just testifying because he wanted somebody to catch his good friend's killer and probably take down his enemies, but it didn't matter. And really, not long after that is really when the Italian Mafia, led by the Trafficante family, began taking control. Charlie Wall was getting older, he was losing support, and he moved to Miami, the South Florida area, not long after that. He kind of disappeared for about a decade, and then in 1950, he reappeared in a very Charlie Wallish way. The Kefauver Commission came to Tampa. The Kefauver Commission was also called the Federal Commission for Organized Crime, I believe. Basically, Estes Kefauver commissioned it to go to all the major cities that were known to be hotbeds for organized crime and hold these public hearings that were broadcast on television, on the radio, to expose the criminals and hopefully try to root out what was going on. Most people who were subpoenaed did not show up. By then, there was a lot of the casinos operating in Cuba, and a lot of the Traficante people just left for Cuba until everything blew over and were helping out with his casino operation there. But Charlie Wall was subpoenaed and he showed up. By all indication, he stole the show. I believe for a day or two, he didn't tell him anything new, but he just sat there for like 2 days telling old stories about the early 1900s and how he used to run things and the characters, and he would start bringing up some of his friends who were killed and start saying, they never were caught and you guys need to catch these people. And again, he didn't say anything new. I don't think he said anything that was of use to the commission, but it got him back in the limelight. And it's probably not a coincidence that shortly after the Kefauver Commission, when he became the talk of the town again, he began spending more time in Tampa. He became a regular here. He was no longer in South Tampa as often. He was back staying in the Ybor City home. But by then, he'd experienced a drinking problem. And he was out and about. He'd be at the bars and he'd really be bad-mouthing the Mafia. You're saying they don't run things the way I used to run things. They don't do it as good. And he was making enemies. And by then, his own family had cut him off. Like, he didn't really have support of any family anymore. He really was very much a loner. Most of his old soldiers had left him. His family didn't want anything to do with him anymore. His nephew, Eddie, who passed away a few years ago, told me the best story to describe what the family thought of Charlie was, he says, Charlie Wall and they had another relative who was a known drunk, and they're sitting on a bench outside of the Wall hardware store, the family's hardware store. And a couple of ladies walked by and said hello. And he said, the story goes that the other cousin looked at Charlie and said, do you know them? And he says, no. He says, but they're either drunk or they're prostitutes, because no one else in this town wants to talk to me anymore. And this is the man, it must have been hard for him, just 30, 40 years ago, was the toast of the town. He'd go to orphanages where the kids would surround him, according to Eddie Wall, and he would hand out, silver dollars and 50-cent pieces to them, and bring presents, and everybody was coming to him asking for their endorsements. And suddenly he was at the end of a bar in the 1950s by himself, telling old tales, drinking way too much, and bad-mouthing the most powerful criminals in town. And that all came to an end on April 18th, 1955. His wife was out of town. She came home that morning and found him dead. His head was battered with a baseball bat, and his neck was slit ear to ear. It's still technically an open case. They've never arrested anybody. Ellis Clifton told me Joe Badami did it. They were certain of that. Joe Badami was one of Traficante's hitmen. He went out for cigarettes one night, I believe in the 70s, and never came back. Eddie Wall told me the same thing. He said that after Joe Badami disappeared, either the TPD or the sheriff's office, I can't remember which, called his family and said, we just want to let you know that Charlie Wall's killer is dead. Or he went missing, but they figured he went dead. And I've asked the Badamis if they think their father killed him, and they would neither deny or confirm it. So it seems pretty clear that Joe Badami was at least one of the men, because anybody who knew Charlie Wall said he would not have let Joe Badami into his house. Charlie Wall may have been a drunk by then, but he knew enough to know that why Joe Badami would have been there. So the thought has always been that there must have been somebody with him who was a friend of Charlie's. Charlie Wall was known to answer the door for friends late at night in his pajamas, invite them in and have a drink with them. The police honed in on 3 people: Baby Joe, who was his driver, Johnny Scarface Rivera, who was the driver and bodyguard, and Nick Scaglione, who was a friend and was the last man to see Charlie alive. He picked him up at a bar and drove him home the night before. None of the men were convicted. None of them were charged. They were kind of interrogated and then let go. They really never were able to link them in any way. One of my favorite stories is Johnny Rivera's widow, who has since passed away, said that when Scarface Rivera was on his deathbed, she said that the widow said that her mother always used to ask him, "Come on, tell me who killed Charlie Wall." And he would never tell her. And then when he was on his deathbed, he motioned over to her mother, his mother-in-law. "Okay, I'm gonna tell you who killed Charlie Wall." And she said he whispered a name. And then when Johnny Scarface Rivera's wife came back, her mother's like, he told me who killed Charlie Wall, told me who killed Charlie Wall. And she's like, well, who? And then she looked at her, she's like, oh my gosh, I forgot. And when I asked him to tell her again, he said, no, I told you once and it's your fault, you forgot. So a bad memory may be why that crime was, we don't have more proof of who it was. So then the next question would be, why was he killed? There's a lot of theories. Some believe that the Traficantes were just, the popular belief is the Traficantes did order the hit. Again, no proof of it, but if Joe Badami did it, it was the Traficantes who would have asked him to. There are a few theories. They were just tired of him talking trash at the bars. Like, we're just tired of this guy. You know, we push him out of power and he won't go away. So they wanted to shut him up. There were rumors that Charlie Wall was looking to get back into the rackets, that he'd been having some meetings in South Florida with some people, and he was looking to, get back into gambling and other crimes, and maybe moving in on some of the Traficantes' territory. But about a year ago, I came upon a third reason. Again, the Vice Squad, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Vice Squad, was charged with bringing down organized crime back then. And I'll just say about a large cache of about 50 of their files fell off a truck and into my email inbox. I had a bunch of PDFs. They just appeared there one day. And they had a lot of information about this era of organized crime that I'd never heard about, people had never heard about. And so I'm scanning it, and there was one sentence that stood out to me. And it said that Traficante Jr. was, Santo Traficante Jr. was upset because somebody had indirectly told him that Charlie Wall had given information to the IRS that helped lead the Traficantes' indictment by the government. There was nothing else about it, just that one sentence. So I started looking into it, and I did find an article from 1959. The Tampa Times wrote that Santo Traficante Jr. and his brother Sam Traficante agreed to pay the federal government $84,920 for back income taxes that they owed. The case, the newspaper article cited, was filed in March 1955. That was 1 month before Charlie Wall died. So we'll never know the truth, but I keep staring at that line, thinking Traficante was supposedly mad, that Charlie Wall basically ratted him out to the IRS. Charlie Wall, according to rumors, was in South Tampa, talking to some people, looking to get some of his power back. What better way to start than maybe needling Traficante by getting him in charge of the government? The charges are filed in March. A month later, Charlie Wall is dead. One of my favorite things that Charlie Wall always used to say was he survived as long as he could because the devil looked after his own. That was his direct quote, just great. And for over 3 decades, I guess it could be said that the devil kept a close watch on Charlie Wall. I mean, he controlled the city in a way that perhaps it's never been controlled since. He was putting mayors, city councilmen. He had control of the police department. I mean, it was what Charlie Wall wanted in the city. He got done. And I guess, as his nephew said, the devil must have finally stopped looking after him in 1955. And, one of the city's most colorful figures died in one of the darkest, most grisly ways. But when you ask Ellis Clifton, it almost seemed like Charlie wanted to go in that way. Ellis says he called Charlie Wall up about sometime in early in April 1955, and said, Charlie, there are rumors they're coming to kill you. If you don't stop whatever it is you're doing, they're going to kill you. And according to Ellis, he said, Charlie Wall said, yeah, I know, and I don't care. And that's it. I mean, there's no denying Charlie Wall's influence on the city. He was a bad guy. Let's not get anything wrong. The good guys here were Ellis Clifton and the other people, but he is as important part of the city's history as anybody that's ever been.
So we had a couple of comments come in, but go ahead and type in some more while we're getting ready to read those out to you. And while you're typing away, Ms. Pam is going to tell you about some library resources and some local genealogy resources.
Okay. We are fortunate to have 2 of Paul's books in our Florida History and Genealogy collection. He's written The Dark Side of Sunshine, which is a collection of stories, I believe, from let me get my little note here, from the Cigar City magazine. And he also wrote a book called Indians to Indian Americans, How Tampa Bay's Indian Community Was Built. Those two are both available in the collection at Florida History and Genealogy Library. You can't check them out, but you can come and use them there. We also have multiple copies of the Charlie Wall documentary available in circulating collection of our libraries.
I don't even have a copy. That's great.
You don't?
I know, I love them all.
You can come look at ours.
I'm gonna have to.
Now we have some shout outs to some of our local genealogical societies. The South Bay Genealogical Society is in Sun City Center, and they sponsor a Genealogy Technology Forum on the first Monday of the month and publish a newsletter called Links, which we do have here, and their information is on the slide. And next is the Pinellas Genealogy Society. And Pinellas Genealogy Society, they have meetings open to the public every third Saturday at 11 a.m. And their contact information is on the slide as well, PinellasGenealogySociety.com.
All right, we'll go into our Q&A session. Remember, folks, you can type away and let us know what you want Paul to talk some more about, or if you have maybe some personal anecdotes, or, you know, maybe somebody whispered a name into your ear on their deathbed. I mean, it's possible. We've got some deep history here in Tampa, so let us know if maybe you know the super secret. We did have some folks chiming in that they have some of these similar memories growing up here in Tampa Bay. One of our viewers commented that their parents played bolita in the 50s in Pinellas County. So see some other folks here talking about growing up in Ybor City in the 50s and 60s, and they mentioned that Charlie Wall's house was over on 17th Avenue, and that if you do some of the tours through the area, some of those tours will stop by Charlie Wall's house. So.
I've been inside the house, and there's actually still bullet holes inside the house, and his hitching post is still there. Like the old hitching post from horses is still outside the house. It's amazing to see something like that.
That's wild.
Yeah, my question, I mean, this is one thing I always heard about bolita, is that they used to give the bolita numbers disguised in some way on the nightly news when TV came to Tampa.
Oh, you're right. They would, I wish I could remember that story. You're so right. There was a newsman who there were certain numbers he would say throughout, and that would be another one of the ways that they would get them out. I mean, and also just when they would read the Cuban lottery numbers, that was, you know, the Cuban lottery numbers would also be used as the bolita numbers. And there was a cover for that too. Like you might say, well, why would they be reading the Cuban lottery numbers here? Because we were only, at the time, flights were allowed. So people used to go to Cuba for vacation or just to visit family and come back, and they would buy lottery tickets while they were there. There are a lot of people I've met over the years that still have their own Cuban lottery tickets that, you know, from Cuba, and that were purchased while living here.
Well, the Cuba to Tampa the connection was big in the 50s.
Yeah.
People back and forth all the time.
Yeah.
Until things changed.
A lot of people worked there.
What about Prohibition during, was Charlie Wall at all involved in that?
Yeah, he was involved in that. I love the Gary Mermino story of what little consequence was of Prohibition here, where the police, you would see police unloading the alcohol and bringing it inside of bars during Prohibition. That's how tough they cracked down on it. And then of course there's the story of the tunnels under Ybor that they used to bring the bootleg liquor in. I've actually gotten a chance to walk through those tunnels. It has been proven in recent years that those tunnels were not built by organized crime. They were actually sewage pipes, and it would be used to flush people's, you know, it was toilet sewage. But it's believed then that the organized crime later, once more modernized sewage systems were made, they then used those tunnels because they did connect the water into a lot of the buildings where booze was sold and numbers were sold. And they also apparently were used to smuggle human beings too out of Cuba.
All right, looks like we have another one of our viewers that has some memories here. that said that their father used to listen to a Cuban radio station to get the bolita numbers, and that there were definitely ties to the Greek mafia at that point. And yeah, looks like there's a strong Tampa and Tarpon Springs connection there from this viewer.
I always like Rene Gonzalez, who started Spanish Lyric Theater. He has a great saying that back then Tampa was Cuba's most southernmost city. Like if you lived in Ybor, you basically considered yourself you were still living in Cuba.
That's amazing. I love that this is something that is still in living memory. So it definitely creates a special part of our history that way.
So how did it start to all go away, or did it?
You know, God, that's a whole nother long story. The murder of Dick Cloud. For people who were around in the 70s, Richard Cloud was worked with the city. His job was to bring down organized crime, and he got fired for being a little too rough with a witness that had nothing to do with organized crime. And a few days later, a hitman walked into his house while his wife and children were away, and they murdered him. And that really led to a large crackdown on organized crime here. The city at that point was finally like, that's enough. Somebody just walked in and shot a former police officer, and it was retribution. Mm-hmm. And I did a story on it a while back where the Badami family admitted he was killed because of them. He had opened up an investigation on the Badami family, and people wanted it to go away. And even though he was no longer with the police force, he was still going to be a witness. And so the Badami family said they did not know of the murder in advance. They did not know what was going to happen. But as soon as Dick Cloud was killed, they knew, oh God, he died for us. And really, that's when the city just cracked down. Greco won in the election. Dick Greco won not long after, and he asked the FBI who he should hire for police chief, and he hired a guy named Babe Littleton, who the FBI said this man cannot be bought by organized crime. And Greco and people who were on the police force at the time have backed this story. They said Greco told them Babe Littleton's in charge. Bolita is dead. Get used to it. And one of Greco's favorite stories that if you ever meet up with him, ask him to tell it is he got a call from his house one day from one of his friends who was in the numbers game and said, we need to meet with you. They pick him up at his house and they drive him over to another guy's house, and he walks in and all the bolita dealers are in there. And they look at him and they say, what are you doing? We're your friends. You're not supposed to do this. You're Latin and you're mayor. You're supposed to protect us, and you're hiring Babe Littleton. And he said, I'm sorry, this has gotten out of hand. It's time for bolita to end. And he said, none of those people ever spoke to him again. And Babe Littleton, you know, absolutely, you can't say put an end to it because obviously it's always going to exist, but he cracked down on it to a point where we were no longer known as the city. As Ferdy Pacheco at least today, we were no longer known as Dodge City of the South.
We do have a question that just came in that says, do you know anything about a guy being machine gunned down on the east corner of 15th Street and Columbus Drive? His wife and child were in the car.
Yes, that was Velasco. Velasco was, that's another long story. I'll try to make it short. Velasco was brought in, I can't remember what year now it was, but he was living in California. He had worked for Traficante. He had moved up to California. He was known as a political fixer. When you need to win an election, you bring him in. He knew where to spread the money, how to get the votes. So they called him in and they said, we need you to help. This is what, all right, let me start off. This is what Velasco's family alleged. We don't know if it's true, but they said, so he flew in from California, moved back to Tampa to help fix this election, get a couple people elected. And he did such a good job that he got a little too big for his britches. It got worried that he had done such a good job that he might assume control of all the rackets here. And so while leaving a party one night with his wife and daughter, he was gunned down. His wife and daughter did survive, but the daughter watches. She's still alive. I've spoken to her, still traumatized from it. Not long after that, his family, not the wife and daughter, but his brother, so angry, they released a payoff list to the public. And it was their brother who died, Jimmy Velasco's, handwritten notes of who was getting paid off, who was getting what bribes in the city, and who he was delivering to. And they said, this is proof of what happened. The city held grand jury hearings on it, and they came back that the list was a hoax, although cannot be ignored, but that some of the people who ordered the grand jury were also on the list. So who knows how true it was, but people I've spoken to over the years, including the great Leland Halls said at the time everybody believed that the list was correct and that the grand jury was a joke. So that's why Velasco supposedly was killed.
It looks like we have one more question that says there seems to be more tunnels being found. Will the public ever have access?
I got the walk-in one, and they would only let me go so far because it wasn't really safe. You'd have, I mean, they seem it. I mean, I made it so far as to get right near, what road is that? That Channelside Drive Road, and it hadn't been caving in. There had been talk that when they demolished the building next to the old Ybor Brewery, where they discovered the tunnels, that they were going to build over that tunnel a glass floor so that people could see it. I don't know. They're still building the building, so who knows if that's going to happen. It'd be nice though. I mean, we have no proof that the tunnels were actually used for smuggling, and there's more proof they were originally used for sewage. But they could have been used for smuggling, like I said, after they ceased being used for sewage, because they definitely connected the water to these buildings. They're definitely a system of tunnels underneath, but you have to be crouched down. You just can't walk through them standing up. You have to, like, you know, be bent over. To walk comfortably through, you have to be like 4'5", I'd say.
We have one more comment.
I'm sorry, no, I will say this though. They actually 3D scanned the tunnels. And at some point, they're going to have, you could virtual reality walk through them at the Tampa Bay History Center. When that's going to happen, I don't know, but that is their grand plan. You have to go there, put on virtual goggles, and actually walk through the tunnels because they scanned them.
That sounds a lot safer than actually going down into some of our soggy tunnels.
I think so.
Yeah, it's kind of gross down there too, I'll be honest.
You can stand up.
Yeah.
We have one more comment that says, my grandmother's cousin was Charlie Wall, who was his mother, and I read he tried to kill his stepmother. Was she a McKay? My great grandmother was a Hendry, but her maiden name was Wall from Brooksville.
Oh. Eddie Wall who was his great nephew, or no, grandnephew, was the best source of stories. It's a shame. We have most of them on video. If you get the documentary, you'll see. He tells these stories. You can tell that he's heard them 1,000 times, and it's worth getting a documentary just to. And I'm saying that somebody won't get paid if you take it out the library, but it's worth just to hear Eddie Wall's stories. They're fantastic. I can't do them justice.
All right, I think that is the end of our questions that are coming in.
Thank you. Appreciate you guys having me.
Well,
So
thank you, Paul. Yeah.
Thank you. If anybody has any questions that might be follow-up questions on this, you can reach us on hcplc.org/contact. That has all of the ways that you can reach us at the library, including that very handy Ask a Librarian function where you can chat or text with one of our Hillsborough County librarians instead of calling. But if you'd rather call, 813-273-3652. We'll get you through to us. We also have the email address for the Florida History and Genealogy Library. If you have genealogy related questions, you can actually send them directly to this email address, and they'll be able to help you out and get back in touch with you. So definitely write that down if that's something that you're working on. And also check out our upcoming calendars for upcoming events, including the other 2 sessions today for this festival. hcplc.org/events has all of our scheduled programs on there, whether they're in person or online. So check that out. I'm going to hand it off to Ms. Pam to give our final wrap up. But for me and my team, thank you all so much. And Pam, I'll let you close it out here.
Thank you all for listening in today, and thank you so much, Paul, for that. You've answered many questions for me about Charlie Wall. I've always been fascinated. And don't forget, we do have newsletters, both the Genealogy and Florida History newsletter that we send out monthly from FHGL, and don't hesitate to send us your email questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day. We hope to see you at our other sessions today.